Hi, this is Fatima. Here let us discuss about routing in ASP.NET Core MVC with some example. Before proceeding to this video, watch my previous video where we have discussed about view model in ASP.NET Core MVC application. What is routing in ASP.NET Core MVC? The routing in ASP.NET Core MVC application is a mechanism in which it will inspect the incoming request URL and then map that request to the controllers and their action methods. This mapping is done by routing rules which are defined for the application. We can also do this by adding the routing middleware to the request processing pipeline. So the ASP.NET Core framework maps the incoming request URLs to the controller's action method based on the routes configured in our application. Routes describe how the URL path should be matched to their actions. Routes are also used to generate the URLs sent out in responses. These routes are defined in startup code or attributes. The different types of routing supported by ASP.NET Core MVC are conventional based routing or attribute based routing. In this conventional based routing, the route is determined based on the conventions defined in the route templates, which will map the incoming request URL to the controller and their action methods. In ASP.NET Core MVC application, these conventional based routes are defined within the configure method of the startup class. In this attribute based routing, the route is determined based on the attributes which are configured either at the controller level or at the action method level. We can use both this conventional based routing and the attribute based routing in a single application. Let us discuss this in detail with some example. This is an ASP.NET Core MVC application we have created with a simple empty project template. Let us use this application in order to understand the routing in ASP.NET Core MVC application. When the request from the browser arrives at our application, it is the controller in MVC design pattern that handles the incoming HTTP request and responds to the user action. The incoming request URL is mapped to the controller action method. This mapping is done by the routing rules defined in our application. Let's add one more method in order to understand this better. So now we have two methods, index action method and the details action method in the home controller class. So let us pass, instead of hard coding directly to get the product details, let us pass this as an ID from this method. Int So now with these changes, now let's run the application and see how the routing rules works. If you issue a request to this home and index action method, with this output it is clear that this index action method of the home controller class is handled that request. Similarly, if we issue a request to this URL, then it is a details action method of the home controller class is going to process this request. Here the parameter value we passed is 1 or 2 is automatically mapped to the ID parameter of the details action method. We have not explicitly defined any routing rules for the application. Then how does this mapping is done automatically? This is actually done by the MVC middleware which we registered in the application's request processing pipeline. So as we already discussed earlier, We can add the required MVC middleware into this request processing pipeline either by calling use MVC with default route method or by calling the use MVC method within the configure method of the startup class. In order to understand these two methods clear, let us view the source code as this is an open source. So let us have a look at the implementation of this use MVC with default route method by visiting the respective GitHub URL page. In this URL, you can see the implementations of the use MVC method with default route source code. If you see this code, this method internally calls the use MVC method, which will add the default route into this application request processing pipeline. The default route is created with this template. Controller is home and the action is index and the ID. If you see this route template, the value home is the default value for the controller and the value index is the default value for the action method. And we have the question mark at the end of this ID parameter, which makes this parameter ID as optional. So if we navigate to the application's root URL, then the request is going to be handled by the index action method of the home controller class. Let us understand this default route template with our example. So let us run this application. So let us navigate to this root URL. You can see the output comes from the index action method of the home folder. The output is same even if we navigate to the home controller alone or if we navigate to the index action method, since the ID parameter is optional. And the default route template maps most of the URL that have this pattern. If you see this URL, the first segment path of the URL is /home. This is mapped to the home controller. We do not have the word controller with this segment, but it maps to the home controller. That is because when ASP.NET Core MVC framework finds the word home as the first segment path of the URL, then it internally appends the word controller. And the second segment of the path and the second segment of the URL /details is mapped to the details action method of the home controller class. And the third segment path of the URL is the ID, which is mapped to the parameter of this details action method. Because of the default route template have the question mark at the end, this ID parameter is optional. So now we have made some changes here, making the ID as nullable and using and checking here if the ID is null, then we are going to use the value 101 for this ID, else we will be using the value that passed from this route. So with these changes in place, now let's run the application. And let us navigate to the home details action method. So by default the ID is 101 as we made change in the code, and if we pass any ID parameter here, the output is changed accordingly. For most of the ASP.NET Core MVC application, the default route works fine. But we can define our own route templates, and if we want to have more control over the routes, we can use MVC method instead of this use MVC with default route method. Let us discuss this in our next video. Hope you enjoyed this video. Our next video is about how to customize the routing in ASP.NET Core MVC. Thank you.